The following list of the 10 countries with the lowest GDP per capita (PPP) for 2025 is dominated by sub-Saharan Africa. 9 of the IMF's 10 poorest economies for 2025 are African. The only outlier, Yemen, is in the conflict-racked Horn of Africa, Arabian Peninsula corridor and shares many of the same structural handicaps. South Sudan, Burundi, and the Central African Republic are the poorest countries as of April 2025. With GDP capita (PPP) of just $716, $1,015, and $1,330, respectively. 1. South Sudan -$716 GDP. South Sudan, independent since 2011, ranks last worldwide in GDP per capita, at just $716 PPP in 2025, despite sitting on fertile land and significant oil reserves. Oil still supplies about 98% of government revenue, but recurring civil conflict, disrupted pipelines, and depressed global prices have shrunk output and public finances. Inflation is forecast to be near 80%, 3/4 of citizens live in poverty, and infrastructure is minimal, most roads are unpaved, and grids rarely reach outside Juba. Chronic insecurity deters investment, keeps agriculture largely subsistence-based, and forces costly food imports, deepening aid dependence, external debt, and ongoing humanitarian need. 2. Burundi -$1,015 GDP. Burundi, a landlocked Great Lakes nation of 13 million, remains among the world's poorest, with a 2025 GDP per capita of just $1,015 PPP and a nominal income below $500. Roughly 80% of Burundians survive on small farms averaging 1 acre, making the economy vulnerable to climate shocks and soil erosion. Real GDP should grow 3.5% in 2024-25, yet chronic fuel and currency shortages choke industry, while prices have driven inflation from 20% to an expected 40%. Only 1 in 10 people has electricity, though new hydropower at Jiji Mulembwe and Rusumo promises relief. External deficits and high public debt burdens and widening trade gaps persist despite aid and mining exports, while rapid population growth compounds poverty despite. 3. Central African Republic -$1,330 GDP. The Central African Republic (CAR), with a 2025 GDP per capita of just $1,330 PPP, remains one of the poorest nations globally. A landlocked and sparsely populated country, CAR is highly reliant on subsistence agriculture and informal trade, with 74% of the population engaged in farming. Diamonds and timber dominate exports, though much activity remains unregulated or illicit. Infrastructure is severely underdeveloped, with minimal roads, unreliable fuel supply, and limited electricity. Rich in untapped resources like gold and uranium, the economy remains stifled by insecurity, weak governance, and dependence on foreign aid. Despite modest growth projections, CAR faces steep challenges: widespread poverty, poor financial access, conflict-related damage, and underinvestment continue to hamper sustainable development and formal sector expansion. 4. Yemen -$1,675 GDP. Yemen's economy has been devastated by prolonged conflict, collapsing infrastructure, and fiscal mismanagement. With a 2025 GDP per capita of just $1,675, it ranks near the bottom globally. Oil once generated 90% of exports, but production has been crippled by war, corruption, and aging fields. Agriculture employs over half the population but is hindered by water scarcity and widespread cod cultivation, while the fishing industry remains underdeveloped. Nearly half the population lives below the poverty line, and inflation and currency devaluation have worsened living standards. Heavy dependence on foreign aid and remittances persists, yet reform efforts remain stalled. Yemen's weak governance, humanitarian crisis, and fractured financial system continue to obstruct recovery and long-term development. 5. Mozambique -$1,729 GDP. Mozambique remains one of the world's poorest nations, with a 2025 GDP per capita of just $663 nominal and $1,730 PPP. Despite post-Civil War reforms and strong GDP growth in the early 2000s, poverty and inequality remain widespread. Over 75% of Mozambicans rely on subsistence farming, and over half live below the poverty line. Agriculture, aluminum exports, and coal mining drive much of the economy, but infrastructure gaps, debt burdens, and vulnerability to climate shocks hinder progress. Foreign aid, IMF programs, and growing Chinese investment remain essential to development. While natural gas and mineral wealth offer potential, public services are underfunded, and food insecurity persists, particularly in rural areas. Recent growth has not translated into broad-based poverty reduction. 6. Malawi -$1,778 GDP. Malawi is one of the world's poorest nations, with a 2025 GDP per capita of $1,778 PPP. Its economy is heavily reliant on agriculture, employing nearly 77% of the labor force and accounting for about 30% of GDP. Key exports include tobacco, tea, sugar, and coffee, making the country vulnerable to global price shifts. Over half the population lives below the poverty line, and infrastructure remains underdeveloped. Malawi faces challenges such as high transport costs, deforestation, unreliable electricity, and limited access to education and healthcare. Despite economic reform efforts and foreign aid, dependence on subsistence farming, low industrialization, and climate shocks continue to hinder development and reduce resilience to poverty and external shocks. 7. Democratic Republic of Congo -$1,884 GDP. The Democratic Republic of the Congo (DRC) remains one of the world's poorest countries, with a 2025 estimated GDP per capita of $1,884 PPP. Despite vast mineral wealth, decades of conflict, corruption, and poor governance have stunted development. Over 76% of the population lives on less than $1.90 a day, and the country ranks among the lowest on the Human Development Index. Agriculture employs most of the workforce, while mining dominates exports, especially cobalt, copper, and diamonds. Much economic activity remains informal. Infrastructure is poor, and political instability deters investment. Though the economy has grown in recent years, poverty, malnutrition, and a lack of basic services continue to define life for most Congolese citizens. 8. Somalia -$1,916 GDP. Somalia remains one of the poorest countries globally, with over 63% of its population living below the poverty line. Despite a fragile security situation and repeated climate shocks, the country has made progress in macroeconomic reform through IMF-backed programs and the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries (HIPC) initiative. In 2024, GDP grew by 4%, driven by better rains, agriculture recovery, and rising remittances. However, high poverty, low labor force participation, especially among women, and widespread informal employment persist. Somalia's economy relies heavily on livestock, agriculture, and remittances. Trade imbalances, a high debt burden, and declining foreign aid remain challenges. With its 2024 entry into the East African Community, Somalia has an opportunity to transition from aid dependence to regional integration and sustainable development.